Well, that did not happen at all. Because Amy was so offended by this idea that she started crying in her office and threw a sandwich at Kevin before he was escorted out by security.
Yo guys, real quick before we get into this banger, could you guys leave a like and subscribe to the channel as well? We'd really appreciate that. Yeah, let's get into it.
Would change cinema as we know it and allow for Marvel to keep creative control over most of their characters. The terms of this agreement was that Sony had the film rights to Spider-Man, and that the other villains and characters attached to this IP also belonged to Sony, including Doc Ock, Green Goblin, Mary Jane, Black Cat, and dozens more. Now, it isn't that Sony owns Spider-Man till the end of time because there are some constraints to this contract. First off, Sony has to release a Spider-Man movie every 6 to 7 years to maintain the rights to this character, and if they fail to do so, the rights go back to Marvel Studios along with all those other characters. And they are aware of this as they've made sure to keep supplying the public with Spider-Man content, with Sony first releasing their Tobey Maguire trilogy that included 3 movies from 2002 to 2007. And when they couldn't get Raimi and Maguire to return for a 4th sequel, they rebooted the whole franchise. Which brings us to The Amazing Spider-Man 2, a movie that left fans disappointed, confused, and was critically labeled a disaster for the studio. Not only being one of the worst performing Spider-Man movies, but it was heavily critiqued for being crammed with too many villains and major changes to Peter Parker's origin story, along with them trying to set up spin-off movies and launch their own cinematic universe. There was even feedback that Kevin Feige tried giving to Sony before the movie released to help them salvage it, but they didn't listen. And after the failure of The Amazing Spider-Man 2, Sony was desperate. They were desperate to correct their mistakes and make some major changes to the Spider-Man franchise to regain the fans' trust and also make a ton of money. Amy Pascal was apparently open to suggestions and was listening to advice from other executives on where to take the sequel. Kevin Feige ended up meeting with Amy to go over the future of The Amazing Spider-Man 3, and she shared that she wanted him to be more involved with this movie and help Sony out. Kevin didn't want to beat around the bush and flat out told Amy Pascal that it wasn't going to work, that their ideas for The Amazing Spider-Man 3 weren't strong enough to save it, and that the idea of him being a backseat critic wasn't going to be the best of his use, because he believed he was more useful when he made something himself, hands-on. He was quite professional with his wording and reassured her that it wasn't Marvel's way to try to regain the rights to Spider-Man or taking more of the box office earnings, and that the services of Marvel Studios would largely benefit Sony if they worked together on this. He even used DC Studios as an example on how they worked with Christopher Nolan to create the Dark Knight series, and how that collaboration largely benefited both parties. Overall, he made the offer. Let's come together and work on the new Spider-Man movie. And for Amy Pascal, she didn't like this offer. As a high-level studio executive, you can imagine there was productive discourse about this, and Amy handled herself with class, polite manners, despite her differences. Well, that did not happen at all. Because Amy was so offended by this idea that she started crying in her office and threw a sandwich at Kevin before he was escorted out by security. I'm not making this up for the video, this actually happened and it's hilarious. Keep in mind...
Well, that's kind of crazy. Throwing a sandwich at someone and crying just because they said your movie idea is bad.
...her office for advice, and she was so appalled by the suggestion of an idea outside of her own that she reacted this way. Imagine what the writers and crew must have gone through trying to share new ideas whether or not there were sandwiches in the room. This wouldn't mark the end of Kevin's attempts to meet with Amy Pascal, but after that meeting, Sony continued to review its options, with there being a long email chain going over their master plan. From some of the leaked Sony emails, we know a little bit about their ideas, and from reading them, it's just hilarious that these are real studio executives writing these poorly worded emails with no grammar in sight. In this one email thread, they toyed around with the idea of The Amazing Spider-Man 3 being an animated movie that had the same cast from previous movies, as they would pivot to animation for whatever reason. Another option for them was to bring Andrew Garfield to the MCU and Captain America Civil War. Instead of casting a new face, they want to continue their current trilogy by creating a shared universe between Marvel Studios and Sony. And their game plan was to have Andrew Garfield in Civil War, then have The Amazing Spider-Man come out a year after, being in 2017. Then in 2018, they wanted to have The Amazing Spider-Man 4, presumably before Infinity War came out, and then in the sacred year of 2020, they wanted a crossover movie. The draft title being Spider-Man versus The Amazing Spider-Man, which would have been bringing back Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man to face off against Andrew Garfield, which turned out to be some foreshadowing of the Spider-Man No Way Home movie, with Sony always having an interest in bringing back Maguire. The cherry on top was that after they made this crossover movie, they wanted to sell the film rights back to Marvel for a high price of $2 billion.
Overall, this should make us approximately $12 billion over 5 years.
There were some other ideas that they toyed around, such as having 2 Sinister Six movies before The Amazing Spider-Man 3, and trying to negotiate with Marvel to get the film rights to Daredevil and Thor, which was a huge reach for them, which they also did acknowledge in the email, to be fair. Thankfully, none of this happened, and it's all some blurry dream now, but Pascal eventually warmed up to the idea of working with Marvel to bring Spider-Man to the MCU. A couple of months later, Kevin invited Amy to his house to pitch an idea to her, which she says is what really convinced her that this was the best direction for Sony and Spider-Man. The idea being, what if Tony Stark makes Peter's suit? And after that, one thing led to another, and Sony and Marvel struck a deal. Sony would retain creative control of its movies and have a final say on the story and character decisions, and wouldn't be restricted in any way. They also had control over the distribution and marketing of their films, which was another generous gift from their deal. And the biggest was the profits. Sony was allowed to keep 95% of the box office earnings from any Spider-Man MCU movie, where Marvel only got 5%. Something important to note, but in 2011, Marvel had bought back the merchandise rights of Spider-Man, so they could still sell toys and merchandise related to their newest Spider-Man movies and any other Spider-Man related merchandise that they wanted to, which is really where the money is at, and billions, because this means Halloween costumes, puzzles, water bottles, stickers, toys, Legos, so many revenue sources that it will infinitely make more than a movie ever could. And for the film deal, there was no money exchange between the two studios at all, as this contract could also be terminated by either party at any point if they wanted to leave. When the news of this deal broke, people were relieved that they wouldn't have to see what happened in The Amazing Spider-Man 3, along with there being a lot of excitement for Spider-Man coming to the MCU, unlocking all these new characters that he could run into, along with the promises that Spider-Man would appear in more movies and would also debut in an untitled Marvel movie before he got his own solo movie. This isn't to say everyone was joyful over the news, as there were a lot of people who wanted Andrew's trilogy to continue. Along with this being disappointing news for Andrew, with him essentially being kicked out of the project, a character he dreamed of playing and even dressed up as at the age of 3 years old. With Andrew Garfield out of the picture, this meant that Marvel needed a new actor to play Spider-Man. An actor who they wanted to play this character for a long time and more than just 3 movies. They also wanted them to be on the younger side, who convincingly looked like a teenager, instead of casting actors who were nowhere near the age range of the characters that they were playing. And as you can imagine, there were a lot of actors who auditioned for this role, with it being such a desirable character for many. Kevin Feige stated that there were over 1,500 actors who auditioned for Peter Parker, with them downsizing that list to the top contenders on who were almost the new Spider-Man. One of them being Timothée Chalamet, believe it or not. He was close to getting the role and was in the top 10 bracket. Timothy even said this was happening at a challenging point in his career, and he wasn't seeing the roles that he wanted to, and thought that he'd be seeing more success after Interstellar. He even talked about this when he accepted an award in 2017 for Call Me By Your Name, that he read the script twice and was really ambitious for Peter Parker, to where he almost went back to knock on the casting director's door to audition again. I also think that this role severely would have restricted or even changed the course of his career, tying him down to such a demanding franchise. It is interesting to wonder what Timothy's career would have looked like if he had put on the suit and joined the MCU.
I would not like him Spider-Man. I don't think it doesn't look right.
Asa Butterfield is another actor who they considered for a while. Known at the time for being the lead of Ender's Game, he was on the younger side, and
I mean, he's quite nerdy, I feel like, in a lot of stuff, but I don't know, still
even
Spider-Man.
being a year younger than Holland. When outlets reported that he was a contender, some saw him as the next Peter Parker, while others thought that he was too tall. He was around 6 feet, putting him on the taller side of the other cast, where Peter Parker in the comics is 5'10". It goes to show how people online can focus on the wrong details because they wanted an actor who could give a great performance instead of being tall enough to ride the roller coaster. One of their youngest actors to audition was Judah Lewis, who was 15 years old at the time. He was one of the frontrunners that they were deciding on, and he was also the exact age that this MCU's Peter Parker was going to be in Homecoming. Something that Sarah Finn, the casting director for Marvel, said in an interview when talking about the casting process was that they wanted their Peter Parker to be fully developed, so he wasn't a couple inches taller in the next movie. She didn't specifically say this about Judah Lewis, however this may hint as to why they may not have chosen him. There were even
He's in the Babysitter films, that's what he's in.
2 actors who auditioned that got declined, but would later join the MCU. One of them being Matt Lintz, an unknown, who had appeared in The Walking Dead and was another actor they considered instead of Tom. You may not recognize him from any of the movies, but he was in the Miss Marvel
but I remember him in Pixels.
TV show as her love interest, Bruno. Joseph Quinn also auditioned and recently talked about this during the press tour for the Fantastic Four. It isn't clear how far into the audition phase he got, because he did mention that he auditioned, but keep in mind that there were over 1,500 other actors who auditioned for this role, so he could have been in the very early rounds. Logan Lerman also auditioned and was in talks for the role. He said he wasn't too eager to get it because it would have been a huge commitment to his career at the time. He also may not have been the unknown face that they wanted because he was known for playing Percy Jackson. And this is an actor who never auditioned for the role, but was a popular fan cast around the time, Dylan O'Brien. He was an actor people wanted to play Peter Parker, who was riding high in the success of Maze Runner. He was mentioned in the Sony emails for being an option if they decided to reboot, but Dylan himself shared that he never auditioned or was reached out to by Sony. Ultimately, Tom Holland would win over the crew through his various auditions. He even got the chance to audition with both Chris Evans and Robert Downey Jr. He displayed a lot of charisma, charm, and checked all of the boxes, as they said. The casting directors had to watch over 7,500 individual audition tapes before they chose Tom Holland. When the news broke, he was a new face to the world and practically an unknown. Now it's hard to imagine a different actor playing this role, as we now know Tom Holland as Spider-Man today. When Sony and Marvel officially signed the contract, it was a couple of months before Age of Ultron came out. Joss Whedon, the director of the movie, shared that he wanted to have Spider-Man show up at the Avengers compound at the end of the movie when Captain America and Black Widow were greeting the Avengers. He also wanted to have Captain Marvel show up for the first time, where they even had a stand-in on the set for her. But this is what Joss Whedon wanted and not the higher-ups at Marvel, because if they included him here, they would have had to completely rewrite Captain America Civil War and get rid of the scene where Iron Man recruits Peter Parker. Since they made that deal, Spider-Man has appeared in 6 different MCU movies, and his next one will be in Spider-Man Brand New Day. Although these two companies shared custody of his character, there was a point where Spider-Man was almost taken out of the MCU and would have been erased entirely. I'm gonna make a video where I cover this, so stay tuned for that.
Interesting. Well,